All right, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Our text is Romans 7, verses 14 through 25. Or at least that's a text we're going to come back to in our discussion. And I'll begin by reading it, although this is a notoriously difficult text to read. We get a little bit of a little glimpse into the Apostle Paul's mind here, and so I'll do my best. It's a different translation than I'm also used to, because I think it perhaps speaks more clearly to the point than the ESV, which is the one I usually read, but I'll give it my best shot. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. Well, that went really well, actually. This gets easier now. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God, who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my body a slave to the law of sin. As we noted last week, for 1,000 years, Christianity so dominated the thought world of the West that essentially everyone's imagination was shaped by the biblical narrative. And in this cultural milieu, at least we might say from the time of the Reformation on, the method of evangelization was very straightforward: to press upon the individual the already agreed upon truths of the gospel. But as modernity marched on, the cultural plates in the Western lithosphere began to shift, and this created a crack, a theological crack, we might say, which gave rise not only to a more thoroughgoing form of atheism, but eventually an anti-theism, whose renunciation of the sacred was hitherto unseen in human history. An anti-culture culture, which sought to desecrate the sacred itself, to deface every image of God, including the one in man. A cultural Mount Vesuvius, as I described it last week, whose magma threatens to turn the Christian West into ash. And therefore the great question of our time, one which confronts all of us, is how do we overcome this prevailing culture of death? The zombie apocalypse, as I called it last week, that's brought upon us by this dehumanizing form of absolute humanism. Well, as we discussed last time, it will require a much more robust and far-reaching approach to spreading the gospel than the method that the church has employed over the last 500 years. One which doesn't just tell the grand narrative, but creates institutions that translate, or transliterate perhaps, the sacred order into the societal order. Institutions that work to instantiate the sacred order itself, or as we might say, that work to create culture, which cultivate the world, establishing God's will on earth as it is in heaven. Now, to aid us in that endeavor, that war of culture, which, by the way, we are always engaged in, right? We're either at war trying to preserve the present culture, or we are at war to overthrow the present culture. But to aid us in that endeavor, that war, my plan is to spend a few weeks in what I'm calling communal contemplation on this evil zeitgeist that we have all breathed in, this demonic spirit of the age. And then I want to open it up to conversation as to how we can, or what we can do specifically to exorcise this spirit out of us, or we might say to expire it, to breathe it out of the body politic. Now, in an effort to limit the scope of these lessons, because an exhaustive account of the genealogy of the late modern social imaginary, the late modern worldview, would require, I don't know, perhaps a year's worth of sermons in order to do it justice. And so it's a topic, if we're going to get into it very specifically, might be better suited to the classroom rather than the pulpit. So what I'm going to do, just so that we can get a sense of it, get a foundation so that we have somewhere to go from, I'm going to restrict our discussion to the notion of the self that has come to dominate the late modern West. Now, by the self, I mean not just an awareness of our individuality, what we often call self-consciousness, but something beyond that, an understanding of the telos of man, of his purpose, of the role humans are to play in the grand narrative. And so self, as we're going to use it, involves notions of human flourishing and identity. In fact, I'm going to use the words identity and self interchangeably in this discussion. So we might say that the self is our often complex answer to the question, who are you? A query which indicates how relational our identity is, because it's a question that someone asks someone else in order to form a relationship with them, even if it's just, a peripheral sort of association. But when you want to establish some kind of association with someone, one of the first questions you're going to ask is, who are you? And it's also, the answer to that question almost always entails reference to a relation. Right? I'm a husband or a brother, a father, a son, a minister, etc. Even if I just answer the question of who are you with my name is Bradley Helgerson, Helgerson is a family name, and so it points to relation. To focus this still further, I'm going to follow Carl Trueman's thesis in his new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which, as Bruce Ashford has noted, is perhaps the most significant analysis an evaluation of Western culture written by a Protestant in the last 50 years. And it's a book that I highly recommend to you. And it's over 400 pages. And so you might think of it this way. If you buy the book and don't read it, you can always use it as a footstool or a doorstop. But I highly recommend it to you. It is quite accessible, even given its plus 400 pages and the depth of the subject. But in his book, Professor Trueman seeks to demonstrate that the current splash over identity, what some call identity politics, that this splash is taking place in an intellectual stream, the sources of which stretch back centuries. And so the aim of his project is to head upriver in an effort to discover the philosophical and psychological springs from which sufficient water was sourced to sustain the 1960s cannonball of the modern self, the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution is, as we might say, or was, a torrent in the lazy river of modern identity formation. Which I guess, again, to put it in different words, is to say that people will often point to the 1960s and the sexual revolution as the start of this new notion of viewing oneself. But while it's a watershed moment, that time period is not where the modern sense of self begins, because there were cultural assumptions upon which that radical ethical shift rested. And it's to those deep intellectual wells, right, to those sources, the older sources of the modern self, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Sigmund Freud and others, that Truman hopes to draw from those intellectual wells a refreshing perspective on our current cultural crisis. C.S. Lewis, in an essay entitled Learning in Wartime, notes the importance of this kind of historical perspective for ferreting out what he calls fashionable errors. He writes, "We need intimate knowledge of the past, not that the past has any magic about it, but because we cannot study the future, and yet we need something to set against the present, to remind us that the basic assumptions have been quite different in different periods, and that much which seems certain to the uneducated is merely temporary fashion. A man who has lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the local errors of his native village. The scholar has lived in many times, and is therefore in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and the microphone of his own age." There has been a lot of nonsense streaming from the megaphones of our postmodern era, from the cultural centers of education, entertainment, big tech, government, etc. The hope is that some historical perspective will help us to be immune to that nonsense and to be better able to contend against it. Or perhaps more precisely, to better frame Christianity as the antidote to that nonsense. Professor Truman's rough outline for the development of the modern self is this. He thinks that there are, very generally speaking, 3 stages of changes that have occurred, that have led to it. The first is the psychologizing of identity. And he lays this at the feet of who he calls the other Genevan, as opposed to John Calvin, but that's Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. The second shift, the second stage, is the sexualizing of psychology. The most prominent figure there, of course, is Sigmund Freud. And then finally, the politicizing of sexuality. And there are a number of figures that one might look at, people like Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, and Wilhelm Reich. So you see, it's the psychologizing of identity, the sexualizing of psychology, and the politicizing of sexuality. Those 3 stages have led to the notion of identity that dominates in our world today. In this series, we're going to focus just upon the first of these stages. On his first day in office, President Joe Biden signed an executive order banning discrimination based upon gender identity in public school sports. An action which paves the way for a federal mandate that all schools receiving federal funding must allow biological males to participate in female athletics. Thus, the order was heralded as a triumph for transgender rights. What is of interest to me at the moment is the path we've taken to arrive at this cultural transition. Because it wasn't many years ago that the idea of men, even if they are dressed as women, competing in women's athletics would have seemed to almost everyone, except perhaps those teaching gender studies at Sarah Lawrence College, but to everyone else as an egregious violation of women's rights. But now, not only is it a legitimate topic of debate, with one set of rights competing against another, but for those who wish to push back against it, finding solid ground upon which to do so has become difficult. The normalization of transgenderism, like many other transvaluations in our society, which is to say the changing of values, has to be considered within the larger context, I think, of our culture's novel conception of the self. Because I think that this push towards normalizing transgenderism is just one manifestation of the revolution in identity which has taken place. One key victory of that revolution is what sociologist Philip Rieff calls the triumph of the therapeutic. Or this is what Truman would call the psychologizing of identity. Although Professor Rieff published his seminal book on the subject in the mid-1960s, it has proven itself to be astonishingly prescient. Rieff's conception of culture has two prominent features to it. Firstly, as we discussed last week, the purpose of culture is to transliterate the sacred order into the societal order, to give us the language and symbols and practices necessary to not only understand the sacred story which undergirds everything, but to aid in our participation in it. In the Christian world, this is what Scripture and sacrament come together to do, and what every cultural institution aims to achieve, to bring societal order in line with the sacred order, God's will on earth as it is in heaven, in other words. Rieff's second cultural feature emerges from this first one. If institutions are to successfully shape us into the divine image, then we must be outwardly oriented, meaning that our identity is to be sought not within our own individuality per se, but in conforming ourselves to the purposes of a larger community. That salvation, from a Christian point of view, that salvation is to be found in the body of Christ, or the assembly of the saints, or the royal priesthood. Now, such a conception of culture doesn't erase the notion of individuality, the necessity of personal professions of faith, in other words. It's not a form of collectivism where we lose the individual, but merely recognizes that identity is rooted in belonging. And thus it is something that is given to you, not something that you create for yourself. I mean, imagine for a moment your identity void of any relation whatsoever, including familial relation and divine, a purely individualistic concept of the self. That's a thought experiment which ends in your disappearance, right? It's not possible. You can't picture really anything in your mind. Which is to say that it's not just extreme collectivist views that can lose the notion of the individual, but quite paradoxically, in hyper-individualistic ones as well. Or to use a different metaphor that I used last time, which is imagine trying to define yourself as a character in a story that has no plot. The point is that identity comes in community, in being part of a larger story. And most fundamentally, it's a community which you didn't create, and a story which you didn't write. The community of your family, for example, was there before you were born into it. And the same is true of God's family and the scheme of redemption, the meta-narrative of history that we read about in the Bible. Now, based upon this theory of culture, Rieff schematizes the history of man into a series of representative types, as Truman calls it. Each embody, supposedly, the spirit of the age in which they were living. And this analytical historical framework, the reason to share it in a sermon and discuss it, is because it allows us to see the emergence of something dramatically different in our present era. A dramatic shift from an outward orientation concerning identity, which marks all previous ages, and an inward one. The first of the four representative types, or eras, is political man. And what dominates this person's imagination is a Platonic or an Aristotelian vision of the good life. As such, the political man finds his identity in the polis, in the Greek city-state. This is where his sense of self is rooted, in the activities of public life, in attending the assembly, in debating in the Areopagus, and serving in the citizen army. The purpose of classical education, after all, was to prepare male citizens to fulfill their civic duty. For man is a political animal, as Aristotle wrote. And interestingly, there is a neoclassical Christian education movement that's become prevalent in the last couple of decades. And its purpose is to prepare citizens for a life of service in God's kingdom, but it uses quite a few of the same principles. Now, as Christianity takes over the West, political man is replaced by religious man. This archetype is perhaps best represented by Christendom in the Middle Ages, in which the entire community was centered around participation in the Christian religion. And what provides religious man his sense of self is his participation in religious activities, in attending Mass, observing religious feasts, giving alms, and other things. Truman rightly points to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales as a classic representation of this cultural type. While each character in that book is an individual with his own profession of faith, ultimately all of those characters find their identity in a communal context, as pilgrims on a journey to Canterbury. That quest is what gives their life direction, meaning, and value. Now, as we get into the modern era, religious man is succeeded by economic man. Economic man, of course, receives his sense of self in commerce, in trade, and production. His part in those things, particularly. People forming their identity around their occupation, their affiliation with a trade union. And my grandfather, when I think of my grandfather, he would have fit into this category best, I think. He saw himself primarily as a worker and a provider for his family. The rise of capitalism, the influence of the Industrial Revolution, and the flight to the cities, no doubt helped promote this approach to identity. But because the means of production in a capitalist economy can change rapidly, as Karl Marx noted, by the way, Rieff saw this as a temporary type, and it was soon displaced by our present representative, psychological man. A character who, instead of gaining his sense of self through conformity to the purposes of a larger community, seeks it through autonomous self-expression. Now, Rieff's schematic, as an attempt at historical analysis, is actually an abysmal failure. It's far too simplistic of a set, sort of a grid by which to give us that much information concerning what really took place in history. I mean, just as a few examples, depending on how we might define the word, political man in ancient Athens was as religious as medieval man in Rome. The center of the ancient Roman city would have been the temple, just as the cathedral is the center of religious Christian man's city. And it is not as if the ascendancy of inner psychological narratives that we'll discuss in more depth in just a moment, but that as a means of reflecting upon identity emerges only in late modernity. On the contrary, many scholars think that it finds its roots in the writings of the New Testament. A great example of which is the inner monologue that I tried to read in Romans 7. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. The conclusion of that sort of internal monologue that Paul writes is him saying, so then I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my body a slave to the law of sin. So there's clearly an inwardly directed sense of self that's present in the first century as Paul is writing about that. And that kind of sense of self is put on full display in the 4th century with Augustine as he writes his autobiography, the Confessions. And we might even say, moving forward in history, Martin Luther. If you know the history of Luther and the beginning of the Reformation, he's sort of the quintessential mixture of religious and psychological man. As Truman notes, he was an Augustinian friar whose life would have revolved around religious observances, and yet whose introspective angst played a key role in the birth of the modern age, in the birth of the Reformation. So the point being is that that kind of complexity is found throughout history, and Rief's schematic simply doesn't account for it. However, as James Davidson Hunter argues, the worth of Rief's kind of typology, of this schematic, is to be measured by the utility of what it allows us to see rather than by its strict historical and analytical accuracy. And what this schema allows us to see is this dramatic shift in the late 20th century from an outward orientation concerning our sense of self, which, as I said, marks all previous eras, to an inward one. Professor Truman describes this radical turn inward as follows. The ancient Athenian was committed to the assembly, the medieval Christian to his church, and the 20th century factory worker to his trade union and working man's club. All of them found their purpose and well-being by being committed to something outside themselves. In the world of psychological man, however, the commitment is first and foremost to the self and is inwardly directed. This novel approach to identity is rooted in the romantic expressivism of the late 18th century, beginning most notably in the writings of philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This was a period of time that philosopher Charles Taylor sees as the beginning of what he calls, and I love this phrase, the age of authenticity, where identity comes through the autonomous discovery of one's most authentic desires, and then being courageous enough to express those desires and to become one's true self. Right? This is to look into your own heart, and you have to decide which of those desires are really you and should therefore then be expressed, and which of those desires are not you and should therefore then be suppressed. This is, and we've discussed this before, but in terms of what Robert Bellah calls it, which is expressive individualism. Which is to say that in late modern culture, it's heroic to say, I don't care what my family or community or what anyone says, any authority whatsoever. I don't care what they say. This is who I am. Hermie the elf doesn't want to be an elf. He wants to be a dentist, right? And to deny this genuine desire is the most grievous of sins today. So while in previous cultures the pursuit of that kind of autonomy would have been viewed as villainy, in our late modern culture, it's heroism. This is our heroic narrative. As the great moral philosopher Mariah Carey has told us, so when you feel like hope is gone, look inside you and be strong. Now look outside you, look inside you and be strong, and you'll finally see the truth that the hero lies in you. Now, Professor Rief charts two dramatic shifts which have accompanied the rise of psychological man. This dramatic shift to the subjective, as we might call it when it comes to identity. The first is a reversal in the role of therapist. Now, this insight, like the rest of the book, is couched in psychological language, but I think it's legitimate to expand it to include community leaders in general, leaders of institutions, including the church. Traditionally, the task of leaders, like the apostles, prophets, and shepherds in the Christian conception, is to train individuals in the language, symbols, and practices of the community so that they might effectively participate in it. For this is where the true self is to be found in fulfilling one's role in the sacred order. And thus the community was seen as a force for good for the individuals who constituted it. That idea, however, faced significant criticism in the 18th century, as we said, where the individual was pitted against the community. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, regarded the notion of communitas, of community, as nothing more than a hindrance to the full expression of the authentic self. And by the time we get to Friedrich Nietzsche 100 years later, cultural institutions, and in particular in Nietzsche's case, the Christian church, is not just a hindrance to expression, but it's become a dehumanizing restraint. That what these institutions do is that they deny life for the individual who adheres to them, who conforms himself to them. They're life-denying, is the language that Nietzsche uses. And so what one must do is cast off these institutions. If humanity is going to flourish, this is what's necessary in order to become fully human, or in Nietzsche's language, in order to become the Übermensch, the Superman, right? For us finally to be independent and to exert our will. Although Nietzsche he was somewhat skeptical as to whether or not modern man was going to do that. He thought we were weak, and so we would probably just submit ourselves to these institutions. What I think has actually happened, likely, is that we finally are asserting this kind of absolute autonomy, but instead of turning us into supermen, it's turning us into weaklings. The purpose of therapy, then, in this view, is no longer to socialize the individual. I mean, I remember when we first started homeschooling, it was like, how are you going to socialize? How are you going to socialize? Now, if you talk about socializing, it's the worst thing you can possibly do to your kids. Don't socialize them, right? But the purpose of therapy, then, is not to socialize the individual, conforming him to the ethos of the community, and more broadly to the divine order itself, but freeing and protecting him from its smothering strictures. Unrestricted self-expression is central to human flourishing, and therefore it must be protected at all costs. This leads to the second reversal, which concerns the role of institutions, and it's really very much tied into the first. Under this sovereign self-ethic, rather than individuals being the handmaidens of the institutions have become the slaves of the individual. In fact, they become the slaves of the individual's personal sense of self. And as a result, institutions cease to be places for the forming of individuals and instead become platforms for their performance, is how Truman puts it. In other words, you don't go to a college or a university anymore to be formed, right, by the sacred order, to be formed by the ethos of the community. It's not about the freshmen who show up and now we're going to shape and form them. We don't come to be formed, but we come to perform, right? Or maybe it's more precise to say to be formed by performing, which helps explain many seemingly bizarre trends, including the creation of safe spaces on college campuses. By the way, there's no need of safe spaces at most churches because people won't preach the full counsel of God, and so the preacher never actually says anything to challenge you, and so there's no need for a safe space. Which, by the way, it makes me think that, a good question to ask ourselves, just as an aside, a good question to ask yourself is, why do I go to church? Is it to be conformed, right, or is it to perform? The purpose of you coming here is to be conformed, is to be shaped by the teaching of Scripture, right, by the traditions of the church. It's not to come and engage in some sort of outward performance. But this is what we see in higher ed, right? This idea of a safe space is a place where students can go to be protected from ideas that challenge their deepest convictions, which might question their own interpretation of themselves and may disrupt their sense of psychological well-being. These spaces are judgment-free zones created to protect free expression. They are to be a respite from the hostile world of intellectual discourse, which they view as an attack upon their identity. And it's not just a safe space, it's not just restricted to some room somewhere, but this is expanding out. It's now including the classroom, and in fact, the entire university is becoming a safe space. Where contrary ideas are verboten. They're viewed as personal attacks, and where spoken words are viewed as acts of violence against the person's psychological well-being. And in fact, they justify then a physical response and defense if necessary. This is the kind of transformation we are seeing on college campuses, where the students are the ones who are in control of the universities, not the president or the board of trustees. They are the ones who make the demands. They are the ones who are telling professors what to teach. In other words, again, what a university has become is not a place to be formed and shaped, but it's become a platform, a safe platform where you can go and fully express who you are, who you've determined that you are. Now, the quick critique of this phenomenon is that we've just raised a generation of snowflakes. And I do find that appealing to say as a form of rhetoric, but the helicopter parents have ruined their children, that they've prepared the path for the child and not the child for the path. But here's the thing, these parents have prepared their children. They have just prepared them for a different world than the one we grew up in. A different world, in fact, than the one that we are raising our children to live in. It's our children who will be the outcasts in the new world, not theirs. Our children will be the misfits, those who are antisocial. And so these institutions are just changing their mission to fit with this new world that is upon us. A world in which psychological man reigns. But the point being is that his rise to prominence was not overnight. It took centuries. The psychologizing of the self was a slow process. And part of it is represented by this radical shift from the traditional conformative approach to education to a performative one. But of course, it's not limited to higher education. But this sense of self has infected all of our institutions, the arts, entertainment, athletics, the media, the military, the church, etc. It is the mindset that gives credence to our president writing an executive order to protect the participation of transgender athletes in female sports. For one's gender identity, meaning one's inner feelings concerning their gender, is to be given priority over the biological fact of their gender. And this only makes sense in a world where the self has been thoroughly turned inward, where feelings now must reign, even if they contradict biological facts. And here's the key point. The reason why they must reign is because these individuals, their sense of identity is dependent upon it. This is where they get their sense of who they are, meaning, purpose, and value in their life. So unless we are able to give them an alternative source of identity, what choice do they have? They're in a terrible place. They have to choose between objective facts and maintaining their sense of identity, of forestalling despair. Most people are not going to embrace despair, even if that means giving up objective reality in order to do so. Most people will continue to cling to their worldview, to their sense of self, no matter how flimsy it might be. And so part of what we have to do is offer them an alternative. And of course, when it comes to Christianity, we do this better than anyone else, where you find your sense of identity. Talk about objective. I'm talking about transcendent, right? That transcends this world, where you find your identity in the Son of God, the Lord Jesus Christ. So another result then of the rise of psychological man, this radical turn to the subjective, is the sidelining of what's called the correspondence model of truth, where something is true if it corresponds to reality, if it corresponds to the sacred order, for that matter. It's the notion of objective truth, that something is true whether anyone believes it or not. And the consequences of individuals, but even more so of institutions, denying this philosophical principle will be catastrophic. Deny gravity by jumping off a high-rise building and the consequences are immediate. Deny biological gender and the consequences may be delayed, but they will be no less tragic. And so also, to go back to the original illustration, for feminists, who a generation ago arbitrarily dismissed the differences between men and women, flouting the sacred order, who now wish to deny transgender men the same advantage, upon what ground do you stand to do so? To what will you appeal? Strict egalitarianism, as you did before? That unless we are equal in every single way, then we are not equal? That is the very argument that transgender men are making to compete in women's athletics. Apart from an appeal to the sacred order, you have nothing upon which to stand. Equity for one is often unfairness for another. So there are two questions left unanswered by what we've presented so far. Firstly, if the inner psychological life of the individual is sovereign, then identity becomes as unlimited as the human imagination itself. And yet, we notice that some expressions are given special protections, while others are not. And so a very interesting question is, why is there that discrepancy? It's a tension that we see within the woke movement between transgender rights and women's rights. So that's one question that needs to be explored. Secondly, why is it so important for someone's self-expression to be acknowledged by society at large? Why is it not enough just to be granted the freedom to think as you please, and for the most part, as long as you don't hurt someone else, to do as you please? Why is that not enough? Why must everyone else affirm your choice, your expression? Why can't a baker who says, listen, I don't want to participate in the gay wedding by making the cake, there are other bakers that you could go to, right, who are happy to do it, I just don't want to do it. Why is it not acceptable to just say, okay, fine, and go somewhere else? Why do you have to force that baker to his knees and say, no, you will affirm me? It's an interesting phenomenon. So those are the two questions I want to explore next week as we continue this study.